call this meeting of the Underhill Planning Commission, January 4th, 2024 to order. Thank you everyone for coming. Are there any additions to the agenda? And any public comment? Okay, that catches us up to being on time, despite me being late. Did anyone have any thoughts on the town meeting report that I sent around? Any like corrections or error, or did it look okay?
Yeah, a couple small.
There's one word that, yeah, it's on the last paragraph on the first page.
Okay.
Is that it? No. It's the last paragraph. Finally, we spent time. You just get rid of time.
Oh, thank you.
A
Yeah.
large amount.
Okay, thank you.
And I also wondered, was Kale on this committee part of the year?
No, the year before.
Okay.
Yeah, I went back and checked the changes to make sure everyone was mentioned.
Good.
So, yeah.
What did you say? Just get rid of the finally?
That time.
We
It
spent
says finally.
time, a large amount of our time.
Oh.
And David, you had a couple?
Yeah, just on non-conforming lots, we didn't actually change things, we clarified the language.
Non-conforming lot, and we have proposed a few clarifications.
Yeah, so actually this is what I thought would
Okay.
work. Putting in after the word reviewing, language regarding, so it would read this way.
Okay.
We also spent time this year reviewing language regarding non-conforming lots and proposed a few clarifications and so on.
Okay, I've got it. I'll make it.
Yeah. And then, I don't know, this is just a quibble, I guess.
Yeah.
The last paragraph, finally, we spent this year in a thorough review. Well, I don't know if we did.
You don't think we did a thorough job?
No.
That's what we said anyway. Mediocre?
You're gonna leave it in.
No, we gotta be honest. I'm deleting thorough. I'm deleting
Just a review.
And we'll aspire to do better in 2024. All right. That's right. Questionable. Right? Okay, thorough's been deleted. Anyone else?
Yeah, that sentence, finally, we spent time, a large amount of our time.
Yeah,
So you
that
just
was
gotta-
already.
Oh, you did, I'm
I
sorry.
deleted the first time.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I will send this to Brad with the changes. Awesome. Great. Okay. I think that takes us to Stacy. Hi. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I first off, I'd like to apologize for missing your December meeting. Totally just a lapse in remembering the meeting. I got busy with my daily routine, and 9 o'clock at night, I remembered that I should have had a meeting. So thank you for rescheduling me. I appreciate that. I had a short presentation. I wasn't quite sure what the group really wanted to focus on, so I kind of have a smattering of information about Underhill's kind of water resources, and then kind of context for some sort of areas, and then we can figure out from the group what makes sense if you'd like to focus on.
Thank you. And would you rather sit here and do your
Sure.
presentation and
If
we can
that's okay.
switch? Yeah, of course.
And
Tim, do you want to
Yeah,
go
I'll
around?
go
If you're gonna-
Maybe I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
do you know, Brian, if I need to share a screen or anything in order for the person online to see, or are they all set?
I think you do need to, but our IT expert is sitting to your left, Boris.
So there's
Don't lose Boris.
share screen. window.
Yeah, I think that,
Press that. That's it, right?
press window and it might show you what you have there.
There we go. Can the person online see my screen? Thank you. So Sandy asked me to, it sounded like you folks were interested in hydrology of areas. So I'm going to kind of run through a bit of information just to provide some context of what we know about areas in Underhill, and then we'll kind of go from there. So please feel free to stop me, interrupt me, ask questions as we go. Or say you already know this and I'll move on.
Stacy, before you start, would you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you, Sandy. I'm sorry. So my name is Stacy Pomeroy. I'm a river scientist with DEC's Rivers program. I cover the northwest side of the state region, Winooski, Lamoille, Upper Lake Champlain, Missisquoi, and I help with the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL crediting world, so I cover kind of a larger region for that work. My work typically is working with communities around flood resiliency, community planning, around their streams and river resources. I also work with community groups, watershed groups, conservation districts, to implement restoration projects throughout those watershed basins. So I have kind of a mix of roles as a physical scientist for our streams and rivers. So looking at that aspect, I partner with other folks who look at the water chemistry and the bugs and the fish. We do a lot of that type of overlap. I also do for our program a lot of the training resources. So some of you may have heard of our river and roads training, which is working with primarily road crews, but also municipal staff and conservation districts and other folks who might be working with towns on their road issues as they relate to those things. So those are some of my Sandy. All right, so we'll just go through a bit of things. All of this information I'm kind of showing tonight is from our A&R Atlas. I don't know if folks are familiar with this tool. I'll provide you this PowerPoint, so there will be links and information back if you want to use it. It's a great mapping resource, and this will kind of give a basis for some of what we'll look at today. There are in Underhill 11 or 12-ish primary streams that are named in town, but there are lots and lots of many unnamed streams and tributaries, and actually many streams that may not even be mapped. So these are just kind of a way of starting to think about our streams. On the A&R Atlas, there is LIDAR, which allows us to look at the Earth in kind of a three-dimensional aspect. And you can start to see areas where the stream channel goes, but also maybe other areas where there's intermittent streams or other drainages that may start to feed into those streams. So the LIDAR is a really nice way of kind of looking at the landscape and seeing areas that, if we go back a slide, oh, it's a little tiny. The ortho, you miss out on things. So the LIDAR begins to show you hillshade and where areas are coming to. So we use this often when we're trying to think about the landscape and can't always see it just through the trees and other vegetation areas. A part of the work that I do, like I said, is to do physical stream assessment on our work. So we have a stream geomorphic assessment, and we have phase 1, which is a lot of remote sensing information, and phase 2 is where we do field assessed information. So we have some of our streams in Underhill that have phase 1, so we've got some remote sensing information on them, and we have a little bit of the Browns River and Lee River and some tributaries where we have some of our field assessed work. out of that assessment comes reports. So we have some reports that we can look to understand the condition of those streams. It starts to help us understand some potential projects and some areas where we may want to focus or come back to for further assessment if we think there's more.
Can I have a request? My screen is not advancing with your presentation.
Okay, let's, sure.
I'm still on the opening screen.
Okay, thank you for letting me know that, because I can't see you behind my screen.
What if we're sharing their own screen?
Let me see. Okay, I'm gonna try opening that again. Share that screen. Now now you're seeing you, but are you seeing the presentation or just yourself?
Just myself.
Okay, so that's not the screen we want to share. Let me try without the presenter view and see if that provides it. Right. Okay, I can't see you, so can you tell me if that just advanced for you?
I'm still at the introductory screen, and it's in PPT, or it's in editing mode. It's not in presentation mode.
Okay. So let's try. Oh, let me try this.
It was a guess and go.
I think maybe I shouldn't hold it up any longer. You should just proceed.
Well, you know what? Is this what you're seeing? This doesn't advance for me. Did it just advance for you?
It just advanced. Yes,
Okay.
it did advance.
We'll just change our presentation here a little bit. Let me shrink this up so you guys can see this.
What did you just do that advanced it? We've had this problem before.
It looks like, I'm not sure why it's linking to a different presentation than what I came to in slideshow view. So I'm now just in my slide deck.
Okay.
Yep. Did it advance for you again?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, but you folks are not seeing the same as he is seeing.
Oh.
So Mike is seeing it. You are not.
Can you do a split screen?
That's what I was just gonna see how tricky I can get. If I can find my little mouse. Oop, there it is. All right. Oh. Wow, that got really big. Sorry, Mike, we're just figuring out how best to do this here.
Sure. I'm on slide 3. If it doesn't work, why don't you guys just go ahead and do your presentation? I'll review the deck afterwards.
Okay.
I'm
Let me.
good now, but I don't know about you.
Okay, I think we'll see what we can figure out here.
Did you have it before? There was like a red box that you dragged down there that was on a different slide.
So I'm going to get Mike up to, so you guys don't seem to see the split screen, which is fine. I'm just not very savvy with my little mouse here. Okay. Slide 5. So Mike, are you seeing slide 5?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll work this through. So we looked at some geomorphic assessment information where we have it in town. This is some reports. I'm going to hop over here and go down a slide. So we can get that information about where we were having the assessment and reporting back out. There's been a number of studies on the Browns River kind of through its years. We also, Underhill has many different wetlands, and they are important to us in context. We often overlap with our streams for those wetlands. There are also areas where they're holding water when we get these large rain events. They kind of store water and release them over time, and they contribute. We also have in Underhill one area where the state has done what's called a Vermont Rapid Assessment study, and parts of the creek are known for high quality for those wetlands. So kind of some interesting areas that are mapped. One thing to know about wetlands is just because they're not mapped on the Vermont map does not mean that there's not a wetland in those locations. So
When you say the creek, do you mean out of Route 15?
yes. Sorry, thank you. So we often will find areas, in particularly along our streams, where there's not something on the Vermont's map mapped as a wetland, but when we go out, there is a wetland next to the stream part of it. So Vermont's wetlands program is working to update their maps, but it's quite a rigorous process. So we just encourage people always to touch base if they think there's an area. We also can look at, go down the slide. We can also look at some of the soil conditions to help us understand where we may have wetland areas, because the hydrology, so the hydraulic soils are mapped. Those are soils associated with wetter conditions. And we can also use soils information that has information based on the potential for flood frequency, that those soils are showing that they've been flooded frequently. So there's a couple of different ways we can look at those areas to learn more about what we might expect. This is just a quick note on why we look at both our streams and wetlands in conjunction, because we find that economically those areas can provide significant benefits in flood reduction and protection. And so how do we look at ways to protect areas that those provide those type of functions? Did it just advance on me? I forgot to turn off the timing. I'm sorry about that. Let me skip back. Okay, so just kind of cruising along through some of your hydrology in your town. You also have some areas that have been mapped as high quality ecological waters, and these are in some protected shorelines. So along Route 15 in the creek, some of those wetlands have some protected shoreline areas that were mapped, and up in the headwaters, there's some ecological high quality waters considered Class A. So very high mountain stream, good condition, expected to have high water quality benefits in those areas. So some interesting pieces to see in your area. How's that working for you, Mike? always feel bad
Yes,
for
it is.
somebody
Thank
else.
you.
Thank you. I try to remember to engage. So there's also good information about bugs and fish in some of the monitoring that's been done in the area. So some in chemistry, we can see some areas where it's been a while since they've done some of the biomonitoring, so bugs, fish, and water quality. I think they did some this past year, and so they'll be updated for some of that information. But this helps us begin to look at not only the physical condition, but how well are our bugs and fish doing based on both the conditions of the physical. So what type of habitat is there for the bugs and fish to have, but also water quality that might be affecting the bugs and fish area. So that helps us look at that type of information. And I've lost my little mouse. Arrows. I have such trouble with these little mouses. I can't see my pointer.
Yeah.
So let me just go back and there it is.
Is there an extra port on your side, Rose?
No. Nope. Okay. Sorry.
Well,
Oh, should we turn? No, it's jumped ahead of me too. Escape. When in doubt, escape. Okay, so this jumped ahead. Back to my wetlands. Wetlands. Soils, wetlands. Sorry, driving too many things here. Hey, we're gonna just see if we can use this. No. Mike, can you still see the screen?
So far, so good.
Okay, we're only working with one slideshow. You folks will see part of the slide deck. I don't know. Will this let us go from? So, Mike, are you still seeing the slides?
I'm on number 12.
Okay. Hey, great. Maybe not being able to find the mouse was a good thing. Okay. So, from our bugs and fish and water quality and our assessment information, the state also looks at areas for impairment or for stressed conditions. There are a few sections along the Browns and on Stevensville Brook that are considered stressed streams. So there's historic potential gravel mining that's occurred in parts of the Browns River. There was some impacts from previous floods. There's been some concern over acid rain inputs. So some of these things have happened because of past impacts. And we haven't been back out to work to see how they're doing. And actually, we had hoped to get to the Browns this year, but we had two staff people leave, so we could not accomplish it. But this area is very dynamic and it has had historic impacts to it. So it's still recovering. Acid rain in general has greatly reduced. And so these are probably things that can be start to move off those stress lists. So those are our goals in these areas. There's also, which was really cool and very interesting in Underhill, many vernal pools that are mapped. So these are areas where are oftentimes in a spring in particular are amphibians, are salamanders and frogs will utilize to lay eggs and hatch. And there are often areas where there's an inflow or groundwater, but there's not an outflow of water. So these are really special kind of areas, and it's fun that there's some mapped. So those are some of the natural inputs in your hydrology in your town. And we can dig into any of those or none of those as you want, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage of some of what you have in the community. Some of the other things that kind of are feeding into hydrology and considerations are like our groundwater resources. We can look at these through understanding our groundwater wells. So there are well log information, and that helps us understand areas that we have, areas we want to be protected so that we don't contaminate something. So wellhead areas or places that we want to make sure people have for safe drinking water. There are also
Stacy, are those ones that you monitor then?
Oh gosh, I don't, but the groundwater and drinking water folks may have some of these that they would monitor. I'm not sure in Underhill if they have any monitoring wells, but oftentimes around the town, if there's a town drinking water supply, those will have a wellhead area around that says no development or no impacts or no contaminants spread in this area. I don't know the town well enough to know, are there some locations where people have groundwater where their wells go dry some years, or we have areas where somebody has an artesian well and it's, bubbling over every year. But it can help us kind of understand inputs into both our river, sort of during dry year, what type of groundwater we might see, or areas that might be affected if there was going to be a change in a development or community or something, and there was a groundwater concern.
But the green dots represent what?
Green dots look like on the private wells that these are screened and digitized. So somebody has located them or it's come from past information. I'd have to dig back into some of the
green is what? They're shallow?
Yeah, so these are private wells.
When you say private, they're not drilled, they're dug or shallow or spring?
It is on a private property. So these are wells that, and I don't remember which year the state started requiring wells to be registered.
But are you talking about drilled wells or shallow, dug, or spring?
These would typically be drilled.
Okay.
Yes. There may be some that are shallow or spring that have just been registered, but probably not. These are probably drilled. So, that's something in this community, if it's like, do you know that many people are using springs, that may be a resource that you want to map or take note of or understand more, because if there's people getting water from shallow groundwater and something changes, that could change how they're getting their water. Or it could be an area of potentially more concern of contamination because it's shallower groundwater. So just things to think about. I'm sorry, in particular on this screen, you cannot see it. There's tiny little yellow dots where there have been some mapped landslides in town. And from our perspective, we often see landslides associated with streams, and folks are concerned about sediment inputs to them, or it's near somebody's home or infrastructure, and those concerns get raised. So we look at landslides in context of just understanding where they are, how they might affect the stream's sediment input or erosion aspects that people have.
So there are a number of spots, but you can't see them on there.
Could we turn off the back lights maybe, or some of these lights? Would people be and here's my.
Oh, yeah, you can see.
So you can't see my mouse either. Can I use a pointer?
Oh, that's good.
And there's a laser pointer. There we go. So there's one here up along the Roaring Brook. There's another one here. There's been a mapped landslide up here. Another one over here. A few along here. So there's been actually a fair share in Underhill that have been mapped. Are folks familiar with any of these areas or any of the landslides?
Roaring Brook, yeah. What was the other one? Roaring Brook.
Yeah, Pleasant Valley, it looks
Well,
like.
where in Pleasant Valley?
Oh, yeah, so
Long stretch of road.
there's a long stretch of road, but it's obviously they've been triggered enough that folks have had an interest and they've been mapped to indicate, these are slides or areas. And most of them, as you can see, are along some of our tributaries and our streams. So that's often where I end up hearing about it because someone would, is concerned about the sediment inputs. There's a home nearby, or other erosion areas. So it is something that we pay attention to. Okay, a couple moving from some of our natural areas, more to kind of the built environment that starts to affect our hydrology and our streams. There is lots of information about our culverts and our bridges, and these can affect our streams because they can be too small compared to what the channel is. So we're trying to squeeze water through a small hole, and they have can be flood risks. In those areas, they can be passage constraints for fish and wildlife because they're create a perch in the stream or too small and dark and critters won't move through them. Or they redirect water like all along this is all of the little cross culverts along the road in Underhill. And so that's transferring water from one area to another so it can change how water and when water gets to a particular location. Aquatic organism passage. So I mentioned that we look at the culverts for how well fish and wildlife can, in particular fish, can go up through. So all the little red dots mean some fish aren't able to go through those from downstream to upstream. Gray means passable sometimes, or for certain fish species. And then occasionally we get a nice green, and those are ones that can pass fish. We work with several groups, including the conservation districts and watershed groups, and that try to work on culvert projects with the communities to improve them for our lens, from our lens, oftentimes water quality or fish passage, but also flood resiliency. So culverts are a strategy within a community towards improving flood resiliency as well as water quality and habitat considerations that we look at. Some of you may be familiar with the municipal general road permit. So this begins to look at which sections of the road in town have some level of connection to hydrology, a wetland or a stream, such that sections of those road may contribute sediment or extra water to the stream because they're hydrologically connected. So if water flows across them, they're going to land somewhere in the stream or wetland. When we look at Underhill, the categories here does not meet, fully meets, partially meets. You guys have a lot of nice green sections. So you're really, the road section's doing really well. There are a few sections, probably, I see a V-Trans coat here. I don't know if you work on the road crew or from the things you probably are in town. Somebody was mentioning a sketchy road tonight. You probably know the sections of road that are more challenging or may have drainage concerns along their side or have ruts, the crown doesn't stay. And those are sections where there's still opportunity for improvement, and the town is responsible for trying to move those forward. Many sections overlap with us in the stream side, so we pay attention to these roads, and we try to work with groups who are out doing this to look comprehensively if there's wetlands or streams or other things that we can work on as projects too. So. Lots of stormwater inputs. So these are where there are mapped stormwater inputs, oftentimes related to permitting or operational. So we're not capturing everybody's backyard level of stormwater inputs. This is kind of a level at which there is, mapped areas where there's a stormwater permit in place. And this is important because we're expecting there's been a large enough land use change that is creating enough stormwater that should be treated or captured so it doesn't change downstream with that extra flow of water or contaminants, so treating that kind of stormwater. As we get here closer into town, there's more mapped, in particular stormwater that's like where your pipes are that drain into particular areas. So we can start to see like, hey, there might be a connection down here that's to the stream. This goes from this parking lot to that parking lot. And in many communities, we are working to figure out, how better to control stormwater in some areas, in particular if it's sending a lot of water into a channel or an area that starts to cause erosion. So there can be some more ideas of where your stormwater areas are mapped. I'm kind of cruising along here, thinking about flood risk areas. So we're looking at flood in a couple different ways. The first, which probably most of you are familiar with, is looking at the inundation flooding maps. So where does the water come up and you get your feet wet because the water is coming up. Surprisingly enough, Underhill actually has relatively modern maps from FEMA standpoint in that they are digital. So it happens that you folks can actually look at your maps on the atlas. Many towns in Vermont still have a paper map that looks like a thumbprint that had chocolate on it smudged across the paper. We're lucky right now in Vermont. There's FEMA resources and USGS resources that are remapping everything to become digital. So we can do better planning. There may be some updates to Underhill's maps based on their new technique and process. And they're also going down to streams that have a watershed size of 1 square mile. So you can see that, like that first slide I showed you, there was all kinds of unnamed tributaries out here, but the only tributaries that are showing any flooding concern are on these big ones. Now they will look more comprehensively at least streams that have a watershed size up to about 1 square mile. And that's usually a stream that's going to be around 15 to 20 feet wide. So it gives a pretty good sense of smaller streams may start to have some level of information on them about flooding. It's still going to be not super detailed, but it'll start to better identify that there are risks of inundation on small streams that we have not historically had information about to provide better for people's awareness. In Vermont, we look at also erosion risk of flooding because we have found that in Vermont, we see as much damage during a flood because a channel moves or migrates or erodes as there is actual inundation issues. And so we in Vermont have taken the approach that it's important to look at both inundation and erosion and be prepared for that in our flood resiliency work. Because in many instances, locations where FEMA had no floodplain map. The building was wiped out because the stream moved 50 feet during the flood event. And we have several communities where FEMA won't pay for anything because they're like, well, you weren't in a mapped floodplain. I'm sorry that the house was destroyed by a flood, but you weren't in a mapped floodplain. So we're trying really hard to make sure that people are looking at both types of flood risks when we do planning, because not everything will be mapped by FEMA. So what is a river corridor and what is the state looking at? So a river corridor is trying to identify the area that conservatively the stream needs to move over time in order to move the water, the sediment, and the materials provided from the watershed. We typically think of like wood materials in order to kind of maintain its most stable form over time, which means it will erode and move, but it's able to kind of do that in a less catastrophic way than when we start to constrain the river more and more by our encroachments. Ooh, did not turn the timing off, I'm sorry. The other part of this is the legislation when it passed the river corridors required us to consider space for a buffer. So this looks at, in the middle picture kind of shows it, we take an estimate of what is the meander pattern over time, would we expect the stream to have based on its watershed size, the type of stream it is, the valley, all kinds of good sciencey stuff. And then the add in extra space so that over time there could be, if development, some level of vegetation between where we might stop erosion and a house. So you wouldn't want the erosion to get all the way up to the house. We could stop it further back and still provide space for a vegetated buffer. It's just to provide that the state does not, we do not regulate any vegetation requirements within that area. It is simply there as a placeholder that the legislation said we should have areas for riparian vegetation. How do we make sure we provide that over time for this channel to have it if it moves? So it's incorporated as a component of the corridor. What do we look at with the FEMA maps compared to the corridor? In some locations, the FEMA map here is this little dot. This is an example of the paper map. And we can see it's much wider than the corridor. And this suggests that during inundation, fudge buckets, during inundation, the water will spread way out to this location. Our corridor says, hey, based on all the good sciencey stuff, if we at least keep encroachment out of this area, there should be enough space for the river to move back and forth over time without it having, with some of that stable aspect to it. Could it use this entire area? Yes, it could. But our society is not often willing to give up this entire area. So the state has taken a conservative approach to look at those minimum areas that the river should use over time. So we will have areas where they're different. In this location, the corridor is much wider than what the inundation map is. And this is because we often see areas where historically, and if you go out to the Browns River at the Mill Rivers Park and you step down in, look at the bridge, go up to the little bridge that crosses over, and you look down the channel, it takes a really big flood for that river to get up and out of its banks in that location. We've seen some pretty good sized floods here, and it has not gone out across that park, right? It's incised, it's deep. So when FEMA maps it, it's only showing there's flood
happening right next to the channel. It's not showing that great big park out there that was historically part of its floodplain, but it's incised, it's dug deeper into the valley, and during a flood, it's only using this much. But because it's holding that much power, it's much more erosive, and we could expect the river to move, which it's doing. If you go out by the school or you go out along the park, walk up to the off-leash duck park area, and you can see the channel is trying to move. It's moving a lot of sediment into that area, and it's trying to give itself some space so that it's not has this tiny little floodplain. It wants to have a big floodplain. So it's much more prone to erosion risk in that area than to the inundation risk. So that's why we may see differences in our corridors and our inundation. Also, right now in Vermont, only 20% of our streams are mapped by FEMA. So a lot of people are like, hey, there's no map here, there's no flood risk. That's not the case, right? So we want to make sure people are thinking about those risks more comprehensively. Lastly, not everything gets mapped, either in our corridors or on FEMA, of where there are flooding. So in town here, this is the Roaring Brook. This is an area of a little community here that gets flooded. It gets flooded for a few different reasons. Sometimes the river comes across, sometimes it's because there is groundwater coming from the hill, sometimes it's road flooding. So there's kind of a whole combination of things happening in this area that are contributing to people's basements getting flooded, to houses getting flooded, to some other things. And those are not things that we capture either with our FEMA map or our river corridor map. So it's important in the community to consider what other reasons people may be getting flooded outside of just, or stormwater. There's, contributions that are getting concentrated in areas. So this was a section of town where we have spoken with the landowners to consider doing additional flood mapping or planning efforts to better understand why they're getting flooded and what mitigation strategies they could move forward with. So it's important in the town to also recognize that we provide maps, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we capture all flooding. And you folks in your planning efforts can highlight, hey, we know this area gets flooded for all these other reasons. It's not on our maps, floodplain maps or the corridor maps, but we know it gets flooded, and we should take that into account as part of our planning concerns because we know it gets flooded. How do these things get used? I'm cruising along. I won't. Regulatory, so the state uses them as part of our permitting, our Act 250 regs, our state corridors permitting, which regulates ag, non-municipal regulated areas. We use them in our municipal and regional planning, so you folks can use these type of maps or information. We use them. Towns zoning. So if you wanted to adopt those, as a town adopts higher standards, you could earn more funding from the state during an emergency relief assistance. So in particular for public assistance. So if your bridge got damaged or your building got damaged and you had high standards, you could get 17% paid for by the state, and a smaller percent has to be paid for from the town. Fudge buckets. Okay, so we've used the corridors, the atlas. You can get all of these maps on the A&R Atlas. For FEMA's maps, Underhill happens to have digital maps, but if you wanted to look at your site more specifically, you can get them on FEMA's maps webpage. Again, I'll provide the slides so you guys can have these locations. We also have some great information on the Flood Ready site, Vermont's website. That was my spiel. I went through a lot. I'm not sure if this is what you were interested in hearing about, or if there's particular things or areas that you had questions on that you would stop sharing here. That would be helpful to speak more of, yes. So I will stop that.
I had one question on one of your last slides
Sure.
about, is it ERAP? The
emergency
relief. What does it take to get into the higher 17.5% reimbursement category?
Right. Let me make sure I did not lose Mike. There's Mike.
Still here.
Thank you, Mike. Generally, it is adopting river corridors. So the town recognizing that erosion hazard risk, or they adopt higher FEMA standards and participate in the community assistance. So it strives to have the community do more outreach and effort for FEMA to kind of give you a higher credit, basically.
So the river corridor, that means you have a management plan?
The river corridor would be within your flood regulations to say we acknowledge the FEMA maps as our inundation areas, and we acknowledge the river corridors as additional flood hazard areas in town that would require a permit or would have no build or some other types of regulations within them. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, this is the worst kind of data because it's just personal experience. I noticed in that big storm that we got like a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, but where we got 3 inches of rain, our brook by our house was like the rate it rose at and how high it rose like far exceeded the flooding over the summer, I think, because it was snow melt off coming off Mansfield, which I assume.
Yes.
Just so fast, right? But it made me think that it seems like Underhill might be particularly susceptible to these winter rains that it seems like might be more common. So I wasn't sure if that's not true,
No.
or if the state's done work on that. Is that frequency of that increasing?
I guess there's a couple things you might have packaged in there. Let me just make sure I'm kind of so Underhill is susceptible to flashy storms because we have a very steep mountain with lots of tributaries coming off it that hits a very flat valley bottom, and so those things get charged and they come cruising down. So we do see flashy aspects to it. The other aspect that we see in Underhill streams and the Browns River, and I'm a map geek, so I could have bored you to death with the LiDAR. But if you're curious, look at the LiDAR of the Browns River, and if you look from the school upstream, and Lee River is also very interesting, you will see large chunks of sediment that are moving through this. It's a high bedload stream, and you will see historic large meander oxbows that when you look on the ortho just look like vegetated forest, but when you peel back the ortho and you look at that LiDAR, you'll see how much that stream has moved and wants to move. And when you look at like where the school is, the meander that's starting to develop, it wants to look like the old meander that's right across that's now forested, right? It's trying to move itself.
Which school are you talking about? This one over here?
I forget we have two schools. I don't have kids in school, so I don't think about it.
Browns River? The middle school?
is it the elementary school on Route 15?
On Route 15?
They
But-
closed
About
the
Jericho.
elementary school that used to be there, and now it's just the middle school there.
Okay, so Mills River.
Oh, that's.
Right there.
Yeah, sorry. I forget that we have 2 schools. If you look at the Lee over by Mount, yes, thank you. That too, especially up by the range, is incredibly dynamic. There's a lot of sediment moving through it. And if you look at the Browns River, like Route 15 here by the park, you'll also see that it's very straight and channelized. And then it'll hit Silly Hill and it'll go poof. And then it'll go through the mill and down through, and then it'll go poof again, and then straighten again. So any little place that there's like room for it to start to spread out that sediment, it's very dynamic. So when the other reason we kind of saw a really fast increase in December's rain is because we have really saturated soils and we have no vegetation that's trying to absorb anything. So when it hit, like there wasn't any capacity in the ground or extra things trying to soak it up. It just, yeah.
My second question was, if you were us and you're like trying to do planning and think about how the practical impacts of this, or like working with other small towns, like what, if we're going to focus on a few things from your perspective on a practical level, what would we be focusing
I think looking at your community to understand where you have current flooding concerns or issues can be really helpful. So you can understand, are there mitigation strategies to address the flooding, or strategies like maybe we don't have more development in this area, or we need a bigger culvert, or so that's a, it's a small chunk. If you want to tackle, I don't know how receptive the community is to additional zoning or regulations.
Well, we're in the process of starting to go through our regulations, which is why I asked the question. Sorry, that's the context behind it.
That's good. So then begin to have a discussion in town about what does flooding mean to the town, right? We know there was an area along the Browns River where homes are built outside of the corridor, but their septic tanks are not, and they're now threatened. And I get the phone call from the landowner who's like, why was I allowed to build here? And we're like, well, I don't have any say in that. So your house wasn't threatened, but your vital infrastructure sadly got put in an area where we know there was an erosion risk. Could we have, how do we prevent that? So it may, yeah, and we can't know all risks, and there's no way that we will, we have streams in particular, like in Stowe, the Little River, it's another really dynamic river, and it's moved outside of our corridor, and we're like, yeah, we picked a conservative width to say society right now does not say let's give the river the entire valley to move around, even though it could, but if we can give it this much space, we at least have a better chance of it being less erosive and dynamic when we get a flood, because we, one, don't have infrastructure in the way that could get damaged when it's moving around, but we also haven't further constrained the channel and moved the issue further downstream.
So as far as FEMA is concerned, we have to go along with the FEMA maps, which are inaccurate, I guess.
So part of the update process that will happen is the towns will get a chance to review maps and have an opportunity to say, ooh, I don't really think that's accurate, or you totally missed this spot. And then they have a process by which they can address those.
Yeah, so that's dealing with the federal government.
It is, but the state has, as another part of our group, the floodplain managers, part of our program, will be working with towns to try to help with that process. And we saw, for example, when there was an update earlier with the maps, some folks may know Silly Hill. There was a house there, which when you look at the size lot that's there now, you think, how the heck was there a house there? But there was a house. It was originally mapped in the FEMA map. When they did the update, that little part did not get mapped, right? And so, again, somebody did not think they were at risk, or they thought they had less risk. And unfortunately, that is a flooding area. So the maps are good, but they're not everything. And this is really where local knowledge can play into how do you make your maps in town relevant for your understanding of where your flooding is, not just where we try from both the federal and the state.
But that house on,
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of questions of what you said earlier. So one, I'll just say my questions, maybe you can answer them. One was you said for us to find out locally what the water situation is or the flooding situation. Do you mean anecdotally talking to people?
It could be, anecdotally talking to people, your group here, or the select board, or your road crew, who may often know, like, every time I get a rain like this culvert, or this section floods, or I need to go out and make sure it gets unplugged. That's probably not going to be on the FEMA map, but it's local knowledge that can say this is a known location. So
that's great. And then the other question was, you said something about people's septic systems being threatened, and they were saying, why were they allowed to go there? What is that process that this even comes up? Is this that the state goes out, some neighbor has complained about a septic system not working, the state goes out and says it's within a corridor, or what?
yeah, so the concern was raised because landowners called the state and said, please help us. Our septic systems are threatened because the stream is eroding. We could look at the A&R Atlas, which has the corridors, and say, oh, it looks like the house was built out of the corridor, which is yay, but your infrastructure, such as your septic tank, was in the corridor.
That had to pre-exist.
Yeah, that had to be old. I don't think that
That's not allowed
the
now.
town would let anybody build in a place like that now.
Not built, it's the septic
well, the
system.
maps changed too.
So,
That's what I mean, that happened, not only that, but an engineer knows that they have to be so far away from a stream and.
so that this,
Talking
We-
prior to
we won't-
1992.
no, this.
No, I'm saying
yeah.
when the system was in the ground.
No, the system's fairly new. This is, do you know where the bank is by Raceway? Do you know the new development that happened? Is it Mountain View?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, it's that development that we have gotten multiple calls from because the stream has moved. We tried to do a protection project with that landowner, and he was more interested in development.
It's actually Jericho.
So
Yeah.
I'm trying,
It's an
yeah,
example.
right. It's an example.
Close enough.
So what we are trying to encourage communities to recognize is these are vulnerable locations. They may move, some may sit there for decades and never move. And I hear this a lot, like, this stream has never moved. But another section of it does move or becomes more dynamic. And so we're trying to make sure that in general, those locations have less infrastructure in them that can get damaged during a flood. And there are very few resources for individuals to do stream bank armoring or protection. And so those landowners are calling me to say, who can help me? And I'm saying, I'm sorry, there are no resources to help you.
The septic systems that you're talking about, that brook, all that water comes from Underhill, right? So what we do in Underhill affects
Sure.
our neighbors.
And
So
by,
it's
yeah,
very relevant.
it all contributes, yes. So when we think about floodplain protection and consideration, when we work, it's important, it's valuable to work across communities, and that's often when we can work with the districts or the regional planning commissions. They can help us think more broadly than just our individual community. And we can think about like, hey, if we protected this floodplain in Underhill and we are able to allow it to flood out, then we're protecting parts of our town, but we're also helping protect people downstream. And that may not feel relevant at some level, but it all adds up to everybody's benefit as we think about how we protect these areas across our watershed. That example I showed you of the wetland outside of Middlebury, that saved Middlebury millions of dollars because that wetland was able to absorb and protect in that floodplain those things. So the more we can work across our towns to think holistically in a watershed, the better.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee the state passing any, given just the crazy amount of flooding, the state coming out with any new rules in this area or no?
After Tropical Storm Irene, one of the larger things that was passed for is more control or more regulation, oversight of what occurs during an emergency or after for the type of work that can happen in the stream. And in particular, that's like dredging the stream, firming the stream, moving the stream, because there was during an emergency, the select board in the town has the ability to say that bridge, that house, that area is threatened by this, and we need to do something to protect it now. And they can authorize that with no input from anybody else, right?
Who pays for it?
That's where we found after Irene, there was not good documentation, and FEMA said, oh, wait. And did this get done to a standard that was like helpful or bad? And so the state worked to say we need to make sure that emergency work is allowed to happen, but is done in a good context and to the best of our abilities so that we can document it and that FEMA will pay for it. And so there was more language put in place to say the community can move forward, but within 24 hours, they need to reach out to the stream engineer and say, we had to do this work because of X. We have 72 hours. We're thinking there's going to be additional damage to some place, and we're going to need to fix it today. I'm able to contact bank, so there's been some, and we know there's a limit of what can be done. So if somebody's got a clogged culvert, they can go out and clean it out. But if there's trees a half a mile upstream from it, they can't go clean out the trees a half a mile upstream, right? They're kind of limiting. So it put more boundaries within the context for that emergency so that we could better get FEMA to pay for those things.
Stacy, one other question. Our zoning regulations say that we have to observe a certain setback from particular streams, different setbacks. But are you indicating that there's also another tool this channel tool that may actually be greater than our setbacks or narrower than our setbacks that we might want to look at or incorporate?
Right. So I have not read your language. So your language may have, you know, 100-foot setback off from the Browns, and within that distance, you can do X, Y, and Z off from this other 50-foot or something. That's often very helpful within the town and more than some towns have. What the state has said is, from the science, here are distances that we would expect over time the channel may utilize for moving. And we would suggest the town consider these as part of their flood areas as a setback distance. So it varies depending on the channel's width and setting of how wide that would be. Streams that have a watershed size under 2 square miles typically have a 50-foot setback on either side, and our much bigger streams then have a corridor, that polygon, based on all of those other stream parameters. So it's one way that the town could look at, are there setbacks that they currently have sufficient, already have a good width? Or are there other locations that should also have some sort of setback? And the corridors may be a way of looking at those type of widths.
As culverts are being updated and replaced, are those sizings being done by the state, or is it left to the towns, or how's that all work?
Sure. So a town can typically ask V-Trans to help them do a hydraulic study, and they'll look at the watershed size, stream type, in-field information, and base the channel, the structure size based on that information. At a minimum, a structure has to be at least the width of the channel. We call it bank full width. So the channel's dimension that has the flow most years. No longer just based on hydraulics. So historically, culverts were sized based on hydraulics. I need to pass a 25-year event under this road. And so you could have a structure that was much smaller than the stream that could pass that flow, but didn't pass the sediment or other materials that might be moving through. And so the state had passed, and I've lost years, that our structures need to be at least bank full. And after Irene, I think it was 2012 or 2013, the state had FEMA acknowledge that those were standards. And so now, if the structure is damaged, FEMA should pay for the full replacement to meet those standards. Where historically they would be like, oh, it's a 4-foot culvert, it's a 12-foot wide stream, you just drag that 4-foot culvert right back up there and we're just gonna put that in place. And we're like, no, now you have to put in a 12-foot structure if the stream is 12 foot, and FEMA needs to pay to put it back, because we don't want FEMA to come back in 4 years when we get another flood and have the same site get damaged again. So the state helped, and we have stream engineers, so if the town had a question or needs site visits, then they can come out and help us also do the sizing for it. I have like overrun my time too, but and was this helpful? Was this the type of information you were looking for? Who should I, Sandy, if I sent you the PowerPoint?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, and then you can distribute it. You're welcome to share it with others. If there's a particular, as you guys get into your review, if you'd like more information, or you'd like me to come back or chat more, or dig into one of these particular things, then I'd be welcome. I'd be glad to come and do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Give you back here.
You're still on this.
You can have a mouse back.
My sister.
And thank you, Michael, for being online and being patient with us.
Thank you.
What? Yeah, sure. Find that. So, did the field and the trees all flood?
It's getting so scary.
It was
After the big rain?
a little bit in the wetland areas, certainly. Yeah, I don't know, that whole Underhill Flats area. But I think it would be great to have you come talk to us some more about that project.
So I have a proposal. The proposal is we could either start talking about the DRB list for 5 minutes, which probably doesn't make any sense, or we could just take the entire next meeting and work our way through the DRB list.
Ryan, I just wanted to say that.
Or yeah, if people from the DRB have something they want to say, maybe we take these 7 minutes and do that, so you don't have to come back.
No, it's just that list is just a very briefly cobbled together list that I started doing when Andrew was our CA. And I intended to elaborate because they were just quick and dirty notes. And now looking back, some of them were quick and dirty from 5 and 6 years ago, and I can't exactly remember what they referred to. So I talked with Charlie, had a back and forth to update that list to try and flesh it out. But it's going to take a while because, so he said, could I be ready for January 18th meeting? And I said, I could try to do that. For instance, one of the issues I remember Dan had with a particular project, that I'd like to talk to Dan about it. I'd like to write down the regulation it refers to, have a conversation with him to update it, put some notes in there, because it would be a total waste of your time to just look at that matrix now.
So what would you guys like us to do? Do you want to say, hey, let's go through it on January 18th? Is that not enough time? I mean, we want to make your list like basically one of our top priorities for the year. So obviously, I mean, that and climate change basically are the two. So, but we want to work off what you think is a good place to start. So would you rather we kick it back or?
I'll give my opinion.
Yeah.
If I even get some of it updated, you could take certain ones, maybe could be highlighted.
That'd be great.
But the idea was that I was going to try to update it, and then we were going to have a DRB work session to talk about what the priorities are. I mean, some were things that I just listed that were important to me, and everyone else on the DRB might say, that's not important. You know? But I haven't had that conversation with them because I haven't updated the matrix yet.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a little bit jumping the gun right now to have you folks even think about it. I think, but I know you need to keep moving along on this.
No, we can focus on other stuff. Could maybe you let us know after you all dig into it a little bit more, like what you think would be a realistic time for us to start on it, just so I can start thinking about when we want to schedule it in?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And we had talked about maybe getting more of an in-depth explanation on each point.
Yeah.
From the DRB.
Well, I had emailed, I'm guessing what started this is I emailed Charlie and said, could someone from the DRB come in and be an expert to guide us through the list? And maybe that's when he emailed you. So, yeah. Well, I'm hoping whenever you all are ready, one or multiple people could come in and go through the list with us.
Is this the list?
It is, but it sounds like we should not be going.
No, because some of it's wrong. I know some of it's
Maybe
wrong.
there's like 5 that you know are priority, and you could, identify some that we could start working on.
Right.
Something like that.
We could start with that, yeah. And what happens too, by the way, I just want to say this, is the DRB works really, really hard. They put it, some of these hearings and these decisions take a long time. So some issues will come up, and the DRB works hard in hours, and 10 hours or 15 hours on a decision. When it's done, although we bring up points and think, oh, that's unclear, we just sort of forget about it. Yeah. Because then we go on to the next one that's 10 or 15 hours, or 20 hours. So some of these things may not even, they've come up once. Maybe out of 20 of these, 15 of them have come up once.
Right, so maybe they're not the highest priority.
Maybe not,
or maybe
Dan,
maybe
what
they
are
are.
your thoughts? Anything about that? You want to say?
I haven't looked at the list for a couple of years.
Yeah, I know. That's way back.
It seems like could try and look at it and give a cursory look and send you all something to look at by the.
Can't we kind of surmise from what you have on this would have been the barriers that you guys face when you're trying to make decisions? I mean, there's enough information here to give us an idea.
Well, I don't think so. Why have you even muddled through it, Lee, when we can maybe explain it better? I can't even explain most of those to you right now.
Well, I can tell you some of them are wrong too.
There, see. So I think it needs more looking on our part and just thinking about it. So by the 18th, I think we can have a little more guidance for you.
You do. So we should take some time in the meeting on the 18th to schedule time with you all.
I think we could pick out a few for you to work on.
Okay.
I have another question since we're
Well,
here.
first of all, thank you. Very much.
I was reading about what makes a good rule and what doesn't, and using language that says you should or you shall or consider, those things, could you talk about that when you do the list too? Is it unhelpful if we say, you should consider this? You know what I mean?
Shall means shall.
Yeah.
If you say shall, that means it's gotta happen.
No,
Yeah.
it doesn't.
Yes, it does. Yes, it
Yeah,
does.
So should
Shall.
is.
Shall is binding.
Shall is binding.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
That's a great conversation.
but having good rules is really important, right?
It is, but it's always, it's a bit of a trade-off, because if you have too specific rules, they may not really apply, or people aren't necessarily regulation friendly, have very specific rules. Like it says, try to minimize the impact of development on forest fragmentation.
It's not very helpful.
I mean, what does that mean?
Exactly.
If we had a if we had a fragmentation or forest overlay district, that we should, so try to minimize, we do the best we can, but, what does it really mean?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I think it's important to allow for judgment. Because there's so many unique situations where you do have to, bend it this way or that way in order to come up with the actual best solution.
Right, that's true, David. So it's both, they're both to be considered.
Trying to find a balance.
Yeah.
I think, by the way, we should appoint David the official liaison to FEMA.
Well, you may know what the start of that.
I feel like that'll pass on an 8-1 vote.
Well, let's see. We'll look into the federal government on this.
I know that's what you want to do, David.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so unless we hear from you
Take it
otherwise.
to Washington?
Yes, right. Okay, that's right. Bus ticket, David. At that point. Unless we hear from you otherwise, then please let us know if it feels like it can't happen. We'll plan on using the meeting on the 18th to do whatever we can and take it from there. Okay.
Thank you for having
Thank you.
us. It's
Yeah.
a great program.
Oh, thank you for your time. Yeah. Does anyone have anything else? Since it's 7:30, otherwise I'll ask if anyone has a motion to adjourn. Anyone? Lee, is there a second? Sandy, all in favor?
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.